Welcome to our 79th podcast for Thanks for Your Service. Our focus is on historical topics relating to the Australian military. You can find us on Facebook, X and YouTube. Just search for Thanks for Your Service. Our website is www.thanksforyourservice.net, and you can also email us at info@thanksforyourservice.net. The theme so far this year with our podcast has been books. And that theme continues with this podcast, and I chat with author Ian W. Shaw. Ian has written a number of books related to Australian military history on a wide range of topics. Joining us from Canberra is author Ian Shaw. What a pleasure it is to talk to you today. Thanks so much for joining us.
No, thanks for the opportunity, David.
Now, the hardest thing for me in terms of preparing for this podcast was to decide on which books to chat about. Do you have a life outside of writing?
The short answer is no. The longer answer is yes, of course I do. I've been doing this for 13 years, pretty much full time, and you develop work habits the same as you do in a normal job. That there are set hours when I like to work. I find my brain works a bit better in the morning, so I'm a morning person. I'll do the research and the writing of notes and stuff like that. Afternoon, I'll type things up. Some days are long work days, others, it's 3 or 4 hours and I'm done. So I treat it like a job, although it's a passion rather than a job.
Let's talk about some of your books relating to Australian military history. Where do you want to start? I mean, there were so many. So I've put down as one of them, On Radji Beach. Is that the correct pronunciation?
Yep, and that's a fantastic starting point, because that was the first one I wrote that really had a military focus. And a lot of my early books grew out of my family and my family background. And the Radji Beach one, my mother and 2 of her sisters all served in the Air Force during the Second World War. 2 of them were Air Force nurses, and my mother was in the clerical side of things, and they told me the story of the Australian nurses shot by the Japanese early on. And then I noticed that most of my uncles and aunties at their homes had a copy of a book called White Coolies, which was written by Betty Jeffrey, who wasn't a survivor. Well, she survived the camps, but she was friends with and part of the 2 groups that came together and provided the nurses who were killed. So at the back of my mind was always this, I'd love to know the full story. And who I know Vivian Bullnickel survived, and I know that 21 nurses didn't survive. Who were those women? What were the forces that led them to finish up on a lonely beach on a large Indonesian island early in the Second World War, being executed? How did all that happen? So it was my second book, and I bounced the ideas around with my agent, who was very keen for me to follow up with that. She pitched it to Pan Macmillan, who were happy to offer me a contract, and it gave me the opportunity to really dig into the lives of the 21 women who were pretty much nothing more than names on memorials scattered around Australia. There's a bit of a funny backstory to how it finished up, because like a lot of Australian men, I guess, I thought, I want to know what happened to the 16 Japanese soldiers who were responsible for the massacre. So I spent quite a bit of time trying to track down every one of them. What happened to them? Did they survive the war type thing? And my editor at Pan Macmillan said, you can stop doing that. You're wasting your time. The story's not about them. The story's about the women. You're telling it really, really beautifully. So there's a chapter I did write, actually, that never made it to the book, and that was whatever happened to those. I talk about 2 of the 16, whatever happened to the other 14. And she was right, I was wrong. But just out of curiosity, I had to satisfy myself as to what actually happened.
What was the context of Radji Beach? What happened for those people who may not be familiar with it?
Well, as the Japanese closed in on the last bastion parts of Singapore, a decision was made to evacuate the Australian nurses. There were 2 nursing units up there. And the nurses didn't want to go. They were ordered out. And so they left. There was 130 Australian nurses on the island, and they left in 2 tranches. The first tranche went on a ship called the Empire Star, which was bombed continuously for 8 hours at sea, but survived and made it back to Perth. The second tranche of 65 were on a ship called the Vina Brook, and it was sunk in Banker Strait between Sumatra and Banker Island. And of the 65 nurses evacuated on that, probably half a dozen were killed when it sank. Probably another half dozen were swept away by the tides and never seen again. But around 40, 45, maybe a few more, a few less, arrived at various parts of Banker Island. And one of the groups that arrived had some wounded nurses plus wounded seamen and soldiers from other shipwrecks. They were at Radji Beach. They lit a big bonfire on the beach to guide other survivors to where they were. And eventually the 22 Australian nurses, probably 120 other mixed civilian and military, were on this Radji Beach. They debated what to do, though, after they'd been there or the main group had been there for 24, 36 hours, and they decided to surrender to the Japanese. And a small group was sent. Local natives had pointed out where Muntok, the main town in that part of Banker Island, was. So a group of them went into Muntok, found the Japanese had landed there the day before or 2 days before, and this group said, "We're part of a much larger group. We'd like to surrender." The Japanese commander sent a patrol out in their equivalent of a 16-man fighting patrol. They took a light machine gun with them. They were all armed. He got to the beach, took one look and decided, well, their enemy. So they divided, firstly, the officers from the other ranks and took the officers around a headland and bayoneted them all to death. Then came back and got the other ranks and civilian males, took them around the headland and bayoneted or shot. They shot a couple of them. Then went back, got the 22 Australian nurses, lined them up at bayonet point, prodded them into the water, and when the water was basically halfway up their legs, the machine gunner opened fire and killed 21 of them. After that, the wounded and old and infirm on the beach were executed as well. So no one will ever know, of the 120, 125 on the beach, you had the group that went into town, maybe 8 people there, Vivian Bullwinkle. A couple of the males survived as well. So probably, let's say, 12 out of 120 survived. Those other nurses who weren't involved, they all finished up at Muntok the Japanese firstly held them in the local cinema, but they spent the rest of the war in POW camps. And I think there were all up 42 went into the camps, and they started dying towards the end of the war of starvation and diseases. And actually, of the 65, I think 42 made it back to Australia. So, it was just a story of I like the resilience of the nurses, the camaraderie, the humour, the fact that they stuck together through thick and thin, and I wanted to explore what impetus was behind that. And the Royal Australian Army Nursing Service, you had to be 25 years of age. You had to have additional qualifications to your basic qualifications. You had to be single. And I think what emerged in Singapore before the war, and certainly as the fighting got closer and closer, was this very, very strong bond between them all. That one of the matrons, as I said, there were 2 units, and one of the matrons, I called her Irene Drummond, but apparently those who knew us pronounced her name Irene. And she was like a mother hen, and she really fussed over all her nurses. And when they were fighting on the Malayan Peninsula, the hospital was based in a former mental asylum, and she would ride around on her push bike bringing cups of tea to them while they were on duty. The second matron was a woman named Olive Paschke, and they called her Busy Bee, and she was the modern professional, let's look at how we can do this better, and was forever trying to implement new ideas that would make everything work just that little bit better. And I think with the 2 different matrons, when they all came together on Singapore Island, it just created a bit of a group dynamic that lasted, and probably till the last one of them died 15 years ago. It was literally a joy to be able to tell their story, because researching that story was just so emotive and so gripping. It was a tough one to write. The scene where the nurses are killed on the beach is maybe a paragraph, 2 paragraphs, and let's say 500 words, and I reckon it took me 2 days to write that 500 words. But you get the rewards. I was reading a typed up diary from one of the nurses who wasn't on the beach, obviously, but who was sitting next to a British officer in the cinema on Muntok. And he said to her, "Don't you worry, dear. The British Army will soon be here and will push those little yellow bastards back to where they belong." And she looked at him and said, "Mate, it's that bloody attitude that got me here in the first place." And I thought, I just loved that kind of thing. Yeah. Another story was one of the nurses, this is late in the war, in one of the camps they were in, was wearing a Jackie Howe singlet and was splitting wood, and she was from outback Queensland. She had the fag in the corner of the mouth and the singlet on and cap on because it was bright sunlight, and the Japanese were guarding them, and she was smiling at a Japanese soldier and saying quite softly, "Yeah, keep looking at me, you bastard, I'll get you one day. This axe is going to chop that bloody head right in two." So there was lots of little things like that, but the camaraderie in particular, I think, was what really grabbed me.
So what year was that book published?
That book was 2010.
Okay, so the next book we're going to have a chat about is The Ghosts of Roebuck Bay.
Yes, I've seen them, I've heard them. My wife and I, with our best friends, went to Broome on holiday, and I had very little knowledge of what had happened there during the war, but we went to the museum and there was a float or a drop tank from a Japanese Zero aircraft which had been recovered during the attack. And I said, "What attack?" And so they explained to me that the second biggest loss of life in an attack on Australian soil was Broome when the Zeros came in. And I had as I said, very little knowledge of it. I knew an attack had occurred, but I thought, well, there's another story. And in many ways, I think I'm a very typical Australian, that you know lots of little bits about things, but you don't know the full story. And when we got back home, I started researching the story, and the more I looked at it, the more compelling it became as well. And it was compelling again because it's a human story. And on the Japanese side, there were a flight of Zeros flew here from Kupang in West Timor, and there were a lot of American forces had evacuated from Java to the Broome area, as well as a lot of Netherlands, East Indies, Dutch citizens and servicemen getting out ahead of the Japanese. And the conventional wisdom was the Japanese did not have an aircraft that could reach Broome and return back to anywhere they'd occupied. And that was proved wrong because they were Zeros, fighter aircraft with very, very large drop tanks attached to them. The tragedy of Broome was Roebuck Bay was full of amphibious aircraft, Catalinas and Dorniers, that had flown mainly civilians out from Java and were heading down to Perth, but this was a stopping off point. And the morning of the attack, early March 1942, the aircraft, the amphibious aircraft, were sitting on, about 8 of them, were sitting on Roebuck Bay. It was nice and calm. It was a very hot day. They'd just been refueled when late in the morning the Zeros came in, did a loop, and in perfect formation opened fire on the amphibious aircraft below them, most of which exploded into flame instantly. And no one will ever know how many died. I think I suggested perhaps 100, maybe 20 more, maybe a few less, because there were no figures kept for how many evacuees were aboard each aircraft. And given that the Catalinas could probably carry a dozen, 15, but there were stories that came out of it that I found quite compelling. And one was a lot of the Dutch women were loath to throw the children into the water they was sitting on the wings of the aircraft, sunbaking actually, when the Japanese arrived. The sea in parts was on flame, so you had this decision: do I chuck my baby in, and do I chuck the children and jump in on them, knowing that the flames are spreading, knowing that this aircraft wing's full of avgas? So there are all these individual decisions made, and they were life or death decisions. And one of the things I wrote about was a Dutch airman swimming on his back away from the flames, and sitting on his chest was a small baby that he'd rescued. And sometime after the book came out, I got an email via the publisher talking about that and saying that child you wrote about was me. And I think the child's parents were killed. Then there were individuals, a guy named Gus Winkle, who was a pilot, a civilian pilot at that stage, and he was at Broome Airfield, and the Japanese shot up the aircraft on Roebuck Bay, continued in a straight line, which led them over the airport, and there were American aircraft Liberators taking off, packed to the gunnels with wounded Americans from the fighting in Java. And they shot down one of those, but Gus Winkle had just arrived earlier on a Hudson, and they'd stripped the Hudson down to carry people, and the machine guns had been removed, were at the side of the runway. And he was sitting there in his aircraft when the Japanese came in, jumped out, picked up one of the machine guns, and rested the barrel on his arm and fired at the 13 zeros as they went past. And this is how quick thinking he was. He thought, I won't be able to follow any of them. They're too fast. So they're all flying this same kind of path. I'll aim at a particular spot and just open fire, and they can fly through the bullets. And he hit one of them, which crashed off Cable Beach. But while he was holding the barrel, it got so hot it burnt through his arm to the bone. And the main road into Broome Airport's now called Gus Winkle Drive. Yeah. And I thought, this is all fascinating for me. And on the Gus Winkle story, I kept going. And there's a statue of him in the main street in Moruya on the south coast of New South Wales, because he went on to join the 18th Squadron, a Dutch squadron that was equipped by the Americans and operated out of Australia. And he was awarded the equivalent of the DFC for sinking a submarine off the New South Wales south coast.
Wow.
And every crew member on his aircraft identified it as a submarine, from the conning tower and this, that, and the other. Many years ago, I used to go spearfishing down there, and I remember having a beer with the abalone divers, one of whom said, yeah, look, there's a submarine out there in about 100 metres, but we consider it a war grave, so no one goes near it. When I was doing the Ghost of Roebuck Bay, I got access to every U-boat and every I-boat, the Japanese submarine. Records are online, and they didn't lose, neither the Germans nor the Japanese lost a submarine off there. There are no Australian subs went down there, no American. So I have absolutely no idea what they hit. Everyone said, it's probably a whale. But had it not been every crew member identifying it, and the abalone divers saying, yeah, there's a sunken submarine out there. Gus Winkle lived to be 100, moved to Australia, then across to New Zealand, and lived to be 100 and died, I guess about 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So, yeah, you get all these stories that don't quite make the book, but really add a bit of colour and depth to what it is you're writing about.
And when was that book published?
Good question. They used to come out every 2 years. The one after Reggie was Glen Rowan. So I'd say 2014.
Okay. And are they all by the same publishers or different publishers?
No. I think I'm up to publisher number 6. Okay. Next book's coming out with a publisher that I haven't worked with before. But yeah, it's funny. As a writer, you're paranoid about lots of things, but you pretty much put your writing fate in the hands of your agent, who you have an idea. And for me, I just can't stop. As soon as I get the idea, I start researching. And as soon as I start researching, I start writing. And I've got a very good agent, Sarah McKenzie. I'll give her a plug. Yeah. And she judges which publishers are most likely to be interested. And so she won't go to every publisher and say, here's what Ian's written. She'll go to the 3 or 4 she thinks might be interested. Mm-hmm. And I had a book published in the United States last year, or the year before, actually, late the year before. And it was a story of an outlaw gang. And there was no one in Australia at all interested. Sarah loved the book and got in touch with a university publisher in Kansas in the United States who said, yeah, we'll publish this. And it was named one of the 15 notable books in Kansas last year. And I got a lovely medal and lovely little certificate. I got an invitation to go over there for the presentation in Topeka, Kansas. But it was the night of the AFL Grand Final, and I'm a Swan supporter. Tickets, book award in Kansas, football in Melbourne. Guess what won?
Okay. Now, the third book we want to talk about today is Missing: War, Sacrifice, and the Search for Justice. So tell us about that book.
It came out of stuff that I'd come across earlier as well. Just before the Japanese attacked in Singapore, there was a game of football, and there's a bit of a theme emerging here. And the game was between the champion Australian Army team and the champion RAAF team. And both teams had played a number of games against other teams in whichever service it was. And there were newspaper reporters there. It was quite a big deal. But a week later, the Japanese attacked, so the newspaper reports hadn't been published. But the two captains, the Army captain, the Army unit that won was with the top Army unit was the 2nd 9th Field Ambulance, a Victorian unit. The Air Force unit that won their title was 21 Squadron, which was City of Melbourne Squadron, flying basically Brewster Buffaloes and Wirraways. The two captains, the captain of the Air Force team was a guy named Darrell. The captain of the Army team, I'll talk about him first, was Harold Ball. And Harold Ball was just 21, but had already played in 2 premierships with the Melbourne Footy Club. And in fact, the best first-year player at Melbourne wins the Harold Ball Trophy. Darrell Sproul, the captain of the Air Force team, was a Hobart lawyer, a very good footballer, but a very nice person as well. And in amongst other stuff I discovered years earlier was that Harold Ball was executed by the Japanese after he was captured in the fighting on Singapore. Darrell Sproul was executed by the Japanese after he was captured following his plane crashing in New Britain. And I thought, wow, this is, the two captains were both executed. Darrell Sproul, I did a bit more digging, and his family from August 1943, when he was shot down, until basically 1947, had no idea what happened to him. He was posted missing, and sometimes it was missing believed prisoner of war, sometimes it was missing believed killed, missing believed captured. And it I won't say it destroyed his family, but it almost destroyed his mother. And I thought, that how many did we have missing during the war that went through this? And the answer is thousands. But it took a lot of really good detective work by people and units I'd never heard of to put together the story of what happened to Darrell Sproul. And it was quite a fascinating story in its own right, but equally fascinating was what was happening back here home, particularly in Hobart. His mother was a difficult person. Everyone, her children, her grandchildren would all describe her as difficult, but she was difficult because of her upbringing. She came from really struggling background down on the Huon Peninsula and out at Macquarie Harbour. And sorry, that's my phone.
Yeah, no worries.
No, it's not. And difficult, hard to like. But then I read where she was at home one day and there was a knock on the door, and she opened the door. I think this is late 47, doesn't matter the date, but it's years after the war ended. And she opened the door, and this man in a suit, and he introduced himself and said, "I'm from Commonwealth War Graves. What words would you like on your son's tombstone?" And she said, "No one's told me he's dead." So the first notification she got, and when I was looking at the story, there's bureaucracy gone wild in it. There are lots of things happening. And I traced the story of the guy who executed Darrell. traced his story, and it was a fascinating story too. He's a Imperial Japanese Navy officer who his entire career, he joined the Navy before the war, but he just always felt he should be in a better position, higher rank. He's in New Britain at the end of a very long and very rickety supply line. His men have got malaria. He hates being there. And suddenly, squadron leader Darrell Sproul is shot down and brought along to him. So he executes him. The Japanese officer, was eventually, as I said, very good detective work, found in a prisoner of war camp in the Soviet Union, brought back to Tokyo, interrogated about the death of Darrell Sproul and some others, was about to face the International War Crimes Tribunal, and he killed himself. No, sorry, that's another one. He didn't kill himself. He was sent to Hong Kong to face the British or the Allied War Crimes Tribunal there, was sentenced to death and was executed, and was in fact the last Japanese POW executed in Hong Kong. And what I found particularly poignant there was letters his wife had written to the tribunal before the sentence of death was passed and after it was passed. And they were letters written by a literate but very, very lonely, very, very downtrodden Japanese woman who said, if my husband goes, I have nothing. I'm a Japanese woman. I'm lower than the lowest Japanese man. And that resonated with the Raji Beach story, because Vivian Bullwinkle hated the Japanese with a passion until she went to Japan for the war crimes trial, and she saw how Japanese women lived and how they were treated, and the value or lack of value that was placed on them. And Vivian said, from that moment on, I couldn't hate the Japanese. And I thought that's, it's very serendipitous. And I mentioned a Japanese officer killing himself before facing the tribunal. That was the officer who ordered the execution of the Australian nurses on the beach. So in the various books, there's cross-pollination, and there are events and people and places, and it just helped me understand the war that my parents lived through, and understand, we go to the war memorial, not on a regular basis, but probably we average once a year, maybe twice a year for other reasons. But it gives me a much deeper understanding, perspective of why that's there, and what it actually celebrates. And what it celebrates is, for me, celebrates the fact that we produce people who are prepared to do what people I've written about voluntarily did. So, that's the story behind basically those three books.
From a military history theme and your writing, what's next for Ian? I
have to be very careful. I've got a couple of books that are nearly complete, but in this day and age, there are sensitivities about them. And one of them is, I call it the Battle of Broken Hill, and it's the story of the two Afghans who ambushed the picnic train on New Year's Day, 1915. And it's a fascinating story as well. It's full of lots of humanity, lots of poignant little scenes, lots of what makes us who we are, in both a good and a bad way. But if you look online, you'll see that there are radical Islamists who are saying, we know the story about 1915, and the white Australians have always treated us like those two guys were treated and would always kill us like those two. And then you've got the kind of right-wing white, Australia for the white man sites that are saying, yeah, look, Muslims, they started killing us back there. They ambush us. They shoot us from behind, and they shoot women first. So I thought, I don't want to put any fuel on that fire. So even though I've written it, I think I've written it from a totally objective perspective. I know that if that is published, I'm going to get either praised or pilloried from both sides. And a similar story, I call it an incident at Surafend, and it concerns Australian New Zealand troops in Palestine in December 1918, a month after the First World War was officially over, and an incident whereby a young New Zealand trooper was shot and killed by an Arab who was stealing his property from his tent as he lay asleep. And the final upshot of all that, and again, there's political interference, there's military incompetence, but a group of Australian New Zealand troops surrounded the village that the murderer came from, and after a period of time, several nights, removed all the women and children and went through the village with chains and pickaxe handles, and probably the only people in there were males aged 16 and over, and possibly killed 40, maybe more. And again, do I want to be responsible for inflaming those kind of things? So they're ready to go, but I don't think they'll ever see the light of day.
And the latter one was an interesting topic because we all, I suppose, we all want to read the good stories about our military history, the heroism, the bronzed Anzac, the Anzac legend, etc. But the reality is that there's also the bad stories. There's something that would probably amount to war crimes these days. So that's an interesting one. Now your repertoire of books include not only the military history about what some of the titles we've spoken about today, but non-fiction books. Too many to talk about today. But where can people find out more about your books? Not only the military history ones, but your other books that you've written. Do you have, how many books have you written in total up to date?
I've had 12 published. The 13th should be out. It's one I've got another week to go to finish it. It should be out for Christmas this year. It's the story of Squizzy Taylor, Melbourne story. That'll be published by ABC Books through HarperCollins. If you go online and look at either Google Ian W. Shaw, because there are a number of Ian Shaws in the world. I'm the W. Shaw. I'm not the English jazz singer. I'm not the dentist from Port Huron, Michigan. Or if you look at Sarah Mackenzie's website, the Sarah Mackenzie Literary Management website, yes. She's got photos, she's got details about all the books.
Yeah.
Where do I go from here? Militarily, I'm kind of attracted to the little known stories and the Pacific War and Australia's involvement in it. I'll tell you a little anecdote if I can, David. Peter Stanley is probably Australia's leading military historian, and Peter's a Canberran, and I've met him a couple of times, and I was reading that he is doing a podcast and writing a book on an incident at a French village called Allonville, and I've probably butchered that pronunciation, and it's when a German artillery round hit a barn where an Australian infantry unit was bivouacked behind the lines, and it basically collapsed a slate roof in on the sleeping soldiers, and I think about a dozen were killed outright, and 50 others were injured. It was regarded as the single biggest casualty list from an artillery shell. And I phoned Peter and said, I see you're doing a book on Allenville. And he said, yeah. I said, how are you going for information? He said, it's lots of stuff about what happened to the survivors, but I don't know a lot about them. And I said, well, I can tell you quite a bit about one of them. He said, who? And I said, my great uncle, my grandmother's younger brother, was killed. He was one of the ones that was killed. And I'd actually written a story for my family, for my mother's family, about Jack Mills, his name was. And Peter said, could I have a look? And I said, yeah, you can more than have a look. I'm quite happy to pass it on to you. So speaking of small worlds and cross-pollination and stuff like that. It is a
small world, because we spoke to Peter only a few podcasts ago, and I think that, as you said, he's got a presentation coming up with military history and heritage Victoria about that. So
yeah, and I'm talking at they've got a day on I think it's called Australia Under Threat 3945.
Yes.
I've been asked to talk about Eddie Leonsky, the American soldier who murdered them, because I've got a book.
Which is another book. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'll be going to that. David Horner's the keynote speaker, but it's being held at the Caulfield RSL in Elsternwick. I grew up in Elsternwick. My father was a member at the Caulfield RSL. The first illegal beer I had as probably a 16-year-old, Dad took me there before a Swans game. I had a beer with him. So, it's a big wheel, but it's going round slowly, but you'll get there eventually.
Exactly. Now, I'm going to wrap up the podcast. We can keep talking, but Ian, thank you so much for your time today. I found a lot of your books via a website called Good Reader, so we'll post a couple of the links to the podcast where people can find your books. But thanks so much again for talking to us today.
No, it's been a pleasure, David. Thanks for the opportunity.
We're keen to hear your feedback by leaving a review on your podcast app. Your reviews helps new listeners find our podcast. If you have any special requests or suggestions for our podcast, please get in touch. And you can help support this podcast via Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee. The links are on our website and Facebook page, and your support helps us with the production of this podcast. Do you have a relative who has served in the Australian military? Our family military history research packages sources records to better understand the service and experience of those who've served. You can find out more information on our website. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your service.